Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for showing up and letting me talk to you a little bit about this. It's kind of a passion of mine. And I can give you a little background. I have a kind of a slide for that, but how I got into to writing about quantum computing and quantum information technology was I found it, I would say probably in the late 80s, early 90s. I started reading about quantum computing. I think it was actually in the Omni magazine, a science fiction magazine. And I have just always followed it as a kind of a layman. And, I want to be honest with you. I'm not a scientist. I love science, but I have the math skills of a journalist. So I got into science journalism. But what I found is, as a science communication challenge for me, I think that trying to make quantum computing, quantum science relevant to a general audience is just a real challenge. And that's what drew me to, I'm a contributor for a blog named the Quantum Daily. And that's one of the reasons I got into it, because as my first slide says, science communication isn't rocket science, but this is actually worse because it's quantum science. So I'll just give you a little bit about me. I'm a science writer for Penn State, cruising in on my 11th year as a science writer. Prior to that, I had worked as a newspaper reporter and a marketing specialist at Penn State for probably about 10 years. Marketing, communications, copywriting, whatever they threw at me. For about 9 months or so, I've been a contributor to the Quantum Daily. And what we're really trying to do is build a quantum community or ecosystem, a hub for us. So that's been exciting for me. I'm also a media studies master's degree student, and I'm specializing in science communication. My goal, in fact, you all are my guinea pigs, because this is probably part of my defense for my thesis project, which is to build a science communication program for STEM students. That's what I'm doing now. So I'm hoping to incorporate some of this into this talk too. And probably my big claim to fame is Leonard Nimoy once gave a talk at Juniata College, and through an amazing amount of BS and pitiful looks, I was able to line my way backstage to meet him, and I still have his autograph. So what I wanted to do first is really give you some science communication basics, just some things that I consider foundational for science communication. And my first tip, no matter where you're at in communicating or not communicating, I'm going to urge you to just try, just do it. And here's why. What I've seen over the past, for me, the past decade or so in science communication, and really kind of science communication and business technology, so if you're in that sphere, I think this applies well, is that the number of science journalists, full-time professional science journalists, has gone away. I think in 1990s, there were probably close to 100 newspapers and organizations with a full-time science communication or science writing, science journalist staff, and they had science pages. And I think now that's down to 19. And that's also happened in the AP, and some of the wire services have cut their science desks. So what that means is that there's no journalist, reporter going out trying to find these important science stories or these important business technology stories. There's no one really trying to craft them for the general public. So what I'm urging people to do, especially scientists, is learn how to communicate and get it out there. Because the days of scientists coming in, science journalists coming in and finding your paper online and writing a story about it and putting it out on the wire probably isn't going to happen. You're going to have to take some initiative to get that out on your own. And I will say, just anecdotally, I have seen this in my own career. When I first started, and my job as a science writer at Penn State is to meet with researchers who have forthcoming science stories that are going to be published. We always try to write about peer-reviewed stories. And my job was to get those stories before they were published, because if they were published days later, they would be in Newsweek, in the New York Times, on CNN, and then I would get scooped. And so it would be hard for me to write about it. That was when I started. I would say now I really have weeks to write stories. In fact, I think I've kind of gotten a little rusty in hitting deadlines, because there's just no one there no one's going to surface those stories except for the very rare ones. So first tip is really kind of just do it. And I think that's a great place to start. It's a great place to learn. My second concept here is what I call it's actually what it's called. It's the information deficit theory. And I think if we're all come from academia, we might understand it. But the information deficit theory has shaped science communication for many, many decades. And it's simply put that information deficit theory looks at people as these empty pots, and we as scientists or science communicators just fill their heads full of knowledge and off they go. But what we really have come to understand is that's way too simplistic, that people have biases, they have heuristics, there's a diversity of opinions, and there's barriers that you have to get into as a scientist. And, I think the reason why academia kind of understands this so well is it feels very much like how we approach teaching. Students come in, we give them information, they go on their way, and they're smart. But I teach classes in journalism and science communication. I know that's not true. And if you look at some of the debates that we're having about science controversies like climate change, you see a little bit of this, in that if I give you the knowledge and then you respond in a way or behave in a way that I think is counterintuitive to the information I've given you, then I get angry and then I start to threaten you. And so what happens is that threat can lead to more reactance and can learn to actually lead to more denial. So what the information deficit theory, the takeaway from this is, when you're communicating, realize first of all, you got to respect the diversity. You got to be able to craft messages in different ways for diverse audiences. And you have to be willing to listen, I think, is the other point here, is about communicating, not broadcasting. I think as a science journalist, I'm really good at broadcasting, putting that information out there, trying to get people to understand it. But in a way, that's only part of the job. The other part of the job is to listen and to respond to those different, behaviors or changes or opinions, and how we're going to shape that. So those are some theoretical concepts I would start with. But some more practical steps that I would take is, number one is remember what your benefits are, and then think about the features. And I'll get into a little bit about how you can kind of style that. But this is actually an old copywriting technique, is you focus on the benefits. So when you're writing about science, if you look at a paper, we tend to talk about the history and the literature and the technology. Then we get to the findings and the meat. What this does, as you'll see in a minute, is really kind of flip that over. So you have to think about, how is this going to benefit the average person? And you can put that at the beginning of the story. That doesn't mean you drop all the features or limitations or anything else, but you really have to make sure that people know what's in it for them. I call it clear, compelling, convincing science communication. And that part of it is trying to make sure that it's compelling, that people are going to be drawn in. What I find is, if you give them the first few paragraphs that interest them, they'll start asking questions. And as they're asking those questions, you want to answer them in your story. So that's another practical thing you can do. Whether you're writing a news release, whether you're writing an op-ed, whether you're writing a blog post about your science or technology, I think that's a good place to start. Also, again, this goes back to this communicating idea. Remember your audience. I write for a general audience. I try to write at about an 8th grade level. When I put my stories from the Quantum Daily into a Word that it can check the grade level, I am not coming even close, but that's a goal for me, is to start working on remembering the audience, a general audience. Usually what I try to go for is short sentences, short paragraphs, break it up, add some voice and quotes. That tends to be what a general audience is looking at. One thing I want to say is, because now I've met several venture capitalists through my duties in the Quantum Daily. And the one thing that I noticed is that there are definitely some venture capitalists who really understand quantum computing way, way, way better than I do. But I would say the vast majority are probably only a little better than the general audience in understanding it. So you have to be careful about how you're communicating to them. And that even applies, I would think, to pitches and things like that. Another point is use mental models. Analogies, metaphors are crucial, I think, in trying to communicate science. The issue here is, for me in quantum science, maybe you guys can help me out with this, is it's really difficult to come up with solid analogies for quantum science. I mean, what's an analogy for entanglement that isn't going to distort the actual meaning? So those are some, I think, science communication basics. And I want to show you maybe one way to explain how to put a story together, a science story together, or any type of, I typically think of a science news story, but you could also use this in a blog post or op-ed or anything like that. And this isn't the only way to do this. There are lots of other ways to approach this. But in my science story pyramid, I start off with a lead sentence. That's, in journalism, lead is usually the first sentence, or maybe the top two sentences, but it has to be very early in the release or the story. And what I want to do is connect them with the why. I want to make this story out of the gate relevant for someone in the general audience. And we have never had a more distracted audience that I can recall as a journalist. I think when I was working in a newspaper, we had about 10, 15 seconds to connect with the reader and bring them into our story. Anymore, I would say that's seconds. So you have to be able to connect with them with a major concept right out of the way. Then I go into major benefits. And this is another place where I like to bring in my sources, my voices, people who are going to explain things in their own words, and hopefully words that the audience can understand. The next part is, I think, where, especially in the quantum field, where we get hung up, is we're so interested in the technology that we want to talk about that first. We want to talk about how many qubits we've got and how long our qubits are entangled, and fidelity and all those things. We want to talk about that first. But that doesn't relate to the audience like a strong benefit. And finally, I think it's absolutely, this cannot be dropped. The limitation sections and the future directions are critical. I think you have to tell people why this might not work. You have to tell them what problems might arise. You might have to talk to them about how the technology might only scale up something, because it's going to be critical. This is where you take the hope, or you take the hype, and you make it more realizable for people. And then future directions is a way to give them some idea of where this technology could lead, even if it's a little speculative. So that's kind of how I approach those. And if there's any questions, feel free to jump in.
Just to give you a pause here, Matt. I mean, the analogies in this environment we use them a lot in this community, and we kind of have to, I think. It's like sitting, the party game where each analogy gets passed from person to person. And I'm part of this problem, right? So I repeat the analogy that I heard, thought I understood. And, as we just had a meet up with a Martinez type of guy who knows his stuff, completely destroyed the analogy that I've been using, for a search algorithm.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's just the wrong way to do it. But I'm like, oh man, I'm guilty of a sin. I've been passing on the wrong way of thinking about it. And I'm thankful that he kind of made me, I'm going to have to go back and retool. But, as this science is really a series of analogies being passed on from YouTube video to YouTube video, from person to person. And you just struck a chord with something that we really need to think about. We got to get these analogies right.
Yeah, absolutely. And because quantum science is so counterintuitive at times, I think it's good to add limitations to those analogies. I will say on my best days, I'll try to catch myself and say, well, this isn't perfect, but here's one way to envision entanglement or something like that. But, we even have kind of an issue of when we explain things, our theoretical approaches become concrete. So if you say, well, if you add entangle two qubits, you'll get, 2n and 2. And then if you add 3, but you're not really talking about how difficult that is to ramp up something exponentially. You know what I'm saying? So even those have to be couched or coached in certain ways is how I am driving at it.
I mean, I would think the average person thinks, okay, you got 50 qubits. Okay, well, just double the amount of work and now you got 100 qubits, but that's actually more than double the amount of work to be done. But we assume it's like, all right, we'll just do it twice as often or whatever.
Yeah, and
that's just wrong.
In order to try to make it understandable, we make it sound simple. And when we make it sound simple, I think we give some kind of false expectations.
Yeah, and that's something we need to figure out. I certainly need to figure out.
Yeah.
That's a challenge. I've never really experienced this in other technical things I've had to communicate. This phenomena that I experience and are party to in the quantum field. Other fields, I didn't really feel we had this issue, this challenge.
Yeah, I did a story about the brain, and it was easier than qubits.
It says a lot right there.
Yeah.
It's a good time to ask this question. You mentioned the brain. I was thrilled to see that slide where I think it was one forward where you had why. The first thing to start with is explain why the content matters to the audience.
Yeah.
It was great to see that because, we speak in 6 dimensions. 98% of what we talk is either what, when, where, how, who, what, and why, right? So you ask yourself, if there's 6 dimensions, there's 720 permutations. So it's a legitimate scientific question to say, well, which permutation is most effective? And it turns out they've done this. And of course, a lot of people are familiar with Simon Sinek, right? Start with why. You're familiar with that book, likely. And the idea is just doesn't mean end with why or not only why, but the point is the more times you start with why, the more likely an audience will concur with you or finish the content. So why is the what, on the other hand, is necessary, but it's secondary. That's my point there. Why first, and the what part is secondary. And along the lines, is people. You also mentioned everyone talks about their technology. Well, it's from the marketing point of view, there's 2 ways to look at things: vendor-centric or customer-centric. Most of the technology people, it's natural to be vendor-centric because everyone knows who they are and what they do. So it's easy to start explaining that and start with what, and therefore lose your audience. And much more effective to go with the why, which is customer-centric. Tell them what's in it for me. So a great start would be 3 reasons why X matters. Something along those lines. So I was really glad to see you say that because it's so unknown with scientists. And it's strange because it's based on science. So you think that's something that...
Yeah.
And people would know.
Yeah. And when I first started as a science writer, I was trained in the old school journalism of who, what, where, when, and then why. And that model does not fit. That comes out to be a really terrible lead where you say, Professor Smith found that X equals Y, and that's it, yesterday, and it's released in Nature and all of that stuff. People really don't care about that. People really care about how it applies to their lives, which makes sense. Yeah.
So the lead would be something like, why is Professor X's discovery of X going to improve your life? Or here's 3 ways that's going to do that. And then click.
Yeah, exactly. What I've learned, and again, 9 months kind of reporting on quantum business, quantum computing, quantum science, quantum research, is what I find is the key problem, the key communications problem for us right now is this idea of hype versus hope. And I look for my colleague Tristan because he has a great story. He literally scolded me on Slack last week about it. But essentially, he was talking about how important it is not to hype a story for the good of the community. So if you hype your technology and venture capitalists flock to you and they put all their money in hyped technology, and then suddenly a year from now it doesn't work or it doesn't scale like you say it's going to, that funding is probably not going to go into other good quantum technology. I mean, it was a great lesson for me to start thinking about. And that's why I think the key problem for us to really sort out is the hype versus hope. On the other hand, we have to give people hope. I hear this time and time again, and maybe you all have a better grasp of this, is the problem of getting people, talent into quantum education programs, into software development, all of those things is really difficult right now. So if you're not giving them some sense of the potential of this technology, I think that's going to hurt the chances of us attracting quality students, quality workers. A quantum ready workforce is what we're trying to build, and you have to give someone hope. So I do have a few tips that I think can help us there, can achieve a balance in our communications. And again, I would encourage you, this just doesn't work for news releases. I think this might work for emails to funders, emails to people in the government if you're looking for grants. I think it's good solid practice, writing practice all the way. And the first thing sounds a little simplistic, but setting expectations. And for me, I usually use polite language. And if you read my stuff, I think sometimes it may come off as a little wishy-washy. That's with intent, because I want people to understand that science is really an evolution of thought and of opinion and of development. It is always updating itself. It's alive, in other words. So I like to use polite language, may, could, I add likelihood, possibility, things like that, to give someone, maybe even subliminally, some type of sense that things could change. And that way, 20 years from now, when they look back on it, they're not, I don't lose my credibility either. So there are some other key terms that I try to avoid. Breakthrough, cure, prove are all a little too hypey for me. I once wrote a story about a leukemia drug that treated mice. And they then, once I put my story through, the headline was changed to cure, that they cured leukemia. And then I had probably 4 or 5 phone calls of people on their deathbed wanting to take part in this trial, even though it was still an animal study. So, polite language, make sure you give someone some sense of where this is in the process. That's where the future directions comes in. Where it is in the scientific process, I think that's important too. And that gets, so instead of those words, you might want to try advances. You might want to use treatment rather than cure. I try to avoid prove at all costs because it can come back to bite you. The other two are really essentially kind of linked, but, be honest, be transparent about the limitations. That's why I have a section on limitations. I always try to add something when I'm personally writing that there are ways that this might not work. There are problems with the sample size. There are problems with getting the scalability of the qubits. All of those should be included. And I think, first of all, that does lessen the hype for sure, but I also believe it builds credibility. People tend to trust this then. You've gone beyond just being someone trying to market your technology. You've gone to an expert who's going to give you some advice and you can trust. I think that's another thing that I find works in a story. I've talked to dozens of founders, venture capitalists, scientists in the quantum field in just the past 9 months or so. And what I find, almost all of them have a tone of rational optimism. They're optimistic about the future, but they also admit how tough it's going to be. And I think that is one way to balance between hype and hope. In fact, I think for someone, it gives them a sense of hope, but also instils a little bit of a challenge to them. And I think motivated students and motivated software programmers are going to be able to look at that and say, this is something I really want to be part of. So that's kind of the tone I use. And I have to admit that I think the well-actually person is absolutely critical in the peer review process. When you put out a research paper, you want that peer to say, well, actually, did you try this? Well, actually, this is probably not going to work. Well, actually, you do this. But it can become up to the point where that well-actually person goes from being a critic, a well-meaning critic, to a cynic. And I think that cynic goes against the hope. So I think even if we're critical of a piece, and even if we want to put our opinion, let's try to make sure that we come off as well-meaning critics rather than cynics. The negativity can really get, kind of daunting. And if I put out a story, I know that there are going to be people who criticize it, and I'm okay with that. But I think a critic in his or her heart wants to make that product, that technology better. But I think a cynic is especially with quantum science, which has so many huge implications, I think the cynic might be more about trying to limit change rather than, making a product better. So those are just some of the ways I try to handle the hype and hope paradox. Before I stop yakking, I wanted to let you know a little bit about the Quantum Daily. This is just one of the great synchronicities of my career is I've been boo-hooing that I haven't been able to write about quantum science or quantum physics. Right now I work for the Institute of Computational and Data Sciences at Penn State. It has supercomputers, so I write about supercomputers, but never had a real chance to write about quantum computing. And I was continually moaning about that. And I saw on angel.com or angel.co that the Quantum Daily was looking for a writer and so a contributor. So I applied, and I've never come across a group of people that our mission is so aligned without spending a lot of time together. We have really good skill sets that match up well, but they're interested in creating this quantum community. What they saw was a lot of diverse people talking about it. You might have people talking about it as a business, people talking about it on the research end, people talking about it on algorithm, people talk about it hardware. We wanted to pull that in and create this hub for people interested in quantum. My personal goal is to make it more applicable to the general audience, to get them, rationally excited about it. We look at all different aspects of quantum. So if you do have an idea for a story, I say reach out to us and see if we can get something going. The folks from Chicago Quantum did, and I'm working on a story about them. But so we're looking at business, whether you're in business, whether you're doing research, whether you're creating applications or whether uses, we'll consider it all. We're pretty open-ended about it. And finally, the one aspect of this that we're looking at now is to create a database of all the different players in the quantum space and in the quantum ecosystem, because it is so rangy, it's so huge, and it's getting bigger. And so the database will help kind of codify these different aspects of the quantum ecosystem. So that's all I have, and I'm really interested right now if you have any questions about science communication, quantum science communication. If you want to talk about the Quantum Daily, I'm happy to do that. But I'm also really interested in your own experiences and maybe some of your insights. Already heard some great ideas. So I'll just kind of put it back to you guys.
Thanks, Matt.
Sure.
Matt, another great thing you pointed out was that limitations.
Yeah.
And there's I'm a sales guy, retired, but for 5 decades, my whole thing was persuading people. And there's a sales point of view to look at that. So instead of saying this is a limitation, which I agree with you should be honest and do, you can also add to that and say, wow, here's a limitation. What can you contribute to improve it? Use it as a way to attract people into the field and bring them in from the edge, which is, I think, what you were getting at.
That's really, really smart. Yeah, that's a great idea. I need to start thinking about that when I add that, because I think being more concrete rather just saying a limitation, and pulling people into to that challenge is a great idea.
Let me ask a question that I've been struggling with writing and such, and reading. Quite frankly, reading is a skill that I could probably use some training in. But we call it the Pareto principle, basically the 20-80 rule. Mm-hmm. And, in this context, perhaps that I can get 80% of the information out of 20% of the prose, perhaps, right? And I find when I read, I'm becoming less and less of a sequential reader nowadays, because, you're just kind of almost like a random access disk, to stay technical on the point. I'm boom, 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 looking at, and even in the same manuscript, the same article, and even just disastrously in the same email, right? Is there something a writer can do to attract people with poor attention spans like myself? I guess nowadays we have tools like fonts you can change and all that kind of stuff, illustrations perhaps, but let's say you just had text. What can you do to draw me in and keep me there for more than 2 sentences?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I've become more of a scanner too. And I think the amount of information that's out there, we have the same amount of time, but a lot more information to go through. It kind of makes us scanners. But what I do is really I build my stories based on blocks, so that you go into the lead, and then there might be a quote. So that quote, that changes your thinking, and you want to go in to see what that person says. And then I always have setups for the following quotes. So if you look at my, on the best days, because probably not all the times I'm doing this, but on the best days, it's almost like a trapeze that you go from one point to another point to another point. I tend to do that mainly for that reason, because I want to grip them and I want to pull them in. And, you know, back in the day in journalism, you know, you had so much opportunity to keep people in because they're not going to bounce off to Twitter, Facebook, or, you know, onto another site. And that doesn't happen anymore. So that's one of the things I do. I try to make sure that I have voices, quotes from interesting people, interesting points of view, and hopefully that gets them to the next section, which might get them to the next section. And ultimately, the whole piece can be scannable. That if you're only interested in the future directions, you can kind of find that. If you're only interested in the first 3 paragraphs, you're going to walk away from that story understanding quantum science a little better.
And this is a lifelong skill to learn, I suspect.
Yeah, I think I almost know I developed it when I was writing for the newspaper. I had probably two 600, 700, 800 word stories per day that I had to churn out. And wow. Yeah, and so you learn to think in those blocks. So I remember going to these meetings, and this happens a lot with interviews with scientists, that I think is a great idea to think about as a scientist or as a startup founder, is when you're talking to reporters, give them those bullets. Make sure that they understand those bullets. Give them the lead when you first start talking. Because when I interview, a lot of times, I've even stopped using notebooks and tape the conversations, because I start to visualize the story. And sometimes the end of the interview is the most important salient piece. And I want that, you know, right away. So I'm almost visualizing the story as we talk. So when when you produced a piece of research, you produced a product, when you're talking to that reporter, it's good to know what they're looking for. And I've kind of explained what they're looking for. And then you can fill in those blocks for them. The other thing is, I violate one of the big journalistic precepts, and I'm going to violate it probably with Alex here too, is I'm going to let Alex look at my copy. Now, back in the day, I would have been shunned by the entire journalistic community. But I find that when we're talking about science, but especially about quantum science, I'm going to need Alex and his crew to look over my copy to make sure it's technically correct.
I appreciate that.
Probably a good idea.
Yeah, and it's smart.
Here, why was that previously a bad? Why is that a bad thing? I would think that's common sense. Why did
so they thought that was most of your journalists would consider that a violation of their independence.
Oh, okay.
So if I show it to Alex and then he says to me, well, I want you to put in that I solved the MP complete problem. I did get an email. Someone said they did.
So it's to avoid the bias, that they might bias you in what you're going to say about it.
So we'll have a conversation about that. But I know that, you know, just from meeting Alex and his team, that they're going to look at it and they want to make sure that that stuff gets out correctly too. So I don't want to look like an idiot. And I know Alex and his team don't want to look like an idiot. So we're going to put it, that's one of the tools I use. But I think I even noticed when I was talking to them, the interview, I semi-structured it, but I could tell they knew what points to hit. And that is going to be something that the whole quantum crew is going to have to learn, because when you're speaking to journalists that don't understand quantum science, or even science writers, quite frankly, who don't understand quantum, you're going to have to be a little bit of a teacher and walk them through that. And there are some interview techniques that you can use. If you notice, for example, if you're talking to me and I'm going off on a tangent with my questions, they don't seem to be where they need to be. You can use what's called a bridging technique, is you listen politely and then you say, well, that may be true, but the important part of this research story is this. And if you say that enough, they'll catch on. So as you're in these interviews, make sure that you're shaping your material too right there, because you might not be lucky enough to work with Matt Swayne, who is a cupcake journalist who's going to let you review your copy. You might work with someone who really feels that it's their job to not, and they might put out something that's incorrect or not in context. That's the other thing with quantum science too, is you want to make sure the context is there, because you can throw in a quote there that without the context does sound hypey or impossible. So those are some of the things that I think about.
Any questions from some of the others? John, hey, Terrence, Helen, you out there? You're out there. We need to get you asking questions, Helen, AKA owner.
Hi, Matt. Could you talk a little bit about
Hey, John.
how you measure the success of your writing? How you think about your ability to convey, and what sort of feedback you look for to reinforce whether or not you're getting it right?
Well, that is the best question.
Yeah.
That is a really great question. I can give you the simplistic answer, and then I can give you a deeper answer from my own experience. But the simplistic answer is, of course, I'm going to be looking for how many people read it, how many people share it. I'm going to check the comments out on Facebook and LinkedIn, and especially LinkedIn for me. I find that the troll factor isn't as high on LinkedIn as it is in other areas. But I'm also going to look at criticism too, to make sure that maybe something that I put out isn't, if it's wrong, or if I phrased it, then I can improve that. So it's a constant improvement practice. But for me, the real sign of my success as a science writer, or for the Quantum Daily, is the connections that I establish. And I think that's really hard to quantify. But when I get feedback from a founder who said, hey, you put that story out, and I was contacted by, some venture capitalists, and that means something to me. One of the proudest moments of my life was I worked with a postdoc. I think she was either a postdoc or a graduate student, and she published a study, and I talked to her about it, and we wrote a story, put it out, and it did really well, and the media picked it up, and it was interesting. She worked at the Information Sciences and Technology at Penn State, and she got an interview at Microsoft about a month later, and she said she went into the first round of interviews. I don't know really how it worked, but in her first interview, she started to say, oh, and I just worked on this project. And they said, oh, no, we already read about it in the Seattle Times. And so for me, that was one of the great moments, because she told me, she's like, I felt more confident, and it made me feel so good that they already saw it, and that my work was respected. And so anytime apparently I'm in Seattle, I get a cup of coffee. I haven't taken her up on that. But so those are the intangible moments for me that I think that was much bigger than, let's say, placing a story in the New York Times. And I guess that's the other way to measure the success of something, is if the media at large pick it up and share it. So those are other ways. So there are a lot of ways that I define success in science communication. To be honest with you, sometimes just getting the story out is success enough for me.
Yeah.
Particularly with in the quantum field, just getting the founders or the scientists say, yeah, this is right, you got it right. That's a great feeling for me. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it was awesome. Thanks.
Yeah, it certainly give me some things to think about. It's we seem to be in a world of, the number of likes. Alex and I were talking about this a couple of days ago. It's number of likes and all that. And, but you've added this other dimension of feedback or success, or that.
Yeah.
It's more meaningful, I guess. I'm looking for the words here.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. And one thing that I will say, being a journalist for 20 years and being a science communicator for 10 years, is the impact of science communication, the impact that you can have by getting your stuff out there, getting your work out there, is just, to me, is mind-boggling, because I came from a background where I would put out 30, 40 news releases a year and not have anyone really comment on them. They were more publicity. And that's the other thing is, with science communication, don't think of yourself necessarily as a marketer or as a PR person. Think of yourself as someone who wants to get this information out there and to do good. And then all the PR marketing stuff seems to fall in place. But when I started work as a science writer, I remember having the BBC call me. Like my first week, I never, ever had any reporter outside of maybe regional newspapers contact me. So it was a great feeling. And then I've had news releases that I put out for Penn State where I've connected one researcher, again, a doctoral candidate, had a patent, and I was able to, a company was interested in buying that patent. So it's a really powerful tool, is to be able to communicate. It can pay off in so many different ways, including, I think, financial. I think it is the most, at Penn State, I probably have a large group, about 40,000 people every other week at Beaver Stadium who will disagree with me, but research is the most powerful, most important thing that a university produces beyond these great students that we're putting out. So I think it's kind of critical to understand the power that we have in produce, not only just producing great science, but in getting people to talk about it and getting people to act on it.
Yeah, I mean, science is one part doing the science and the other part is communicating it. I mean, as a PhD, it's part of your job. I've had not arguments, but conversations with others. It's a PhD or a scientist's job is to create new information, and part of that responsibility is to communicate that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't believe it's science until it's been communicated. And I think early on, I think you could make the case that if you published it in a peer-reviewed journal, that you did your job in communicating. But as I talked about earlier, first of all, research now is a global billion-trillion-dollar enterprise. And to think that you're going to cram your study in a journal, and that someone who really needs that information in Argentina is going to be able to access it, it just doesn't work anymore. You have to take part in communicating science.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many signals coming out, right? A person in Argentina just flipped the coin here, right? Mm-hmm. We all are just getting bombarded with stuff, the signal and the noise problem. And so, just by definition, your invention or your discovery is not going to be found anymore. You would think it would be easier.
Yeah, this
But-
is another anecdotal story, but I think it proves your point. I was part of a search committee for a science writer at Penn State. And typically what we do is we give them a study and say, write a story, So the person I worked with went through, I think it was PLOS or a leading journal. And we were pulling out study after study after study. And we wanted to make sure that this person couldn't go online and find a story about that study. And, we wanted to make sure that it was legit. We must have pulled out 8 studies that no one wrote about it. And my colleague who had much longer experience said, she's never come across that. It used to be that some journalist would have picked that up. And this is a leading journal, other journals. So it's important now.
Okay. Any other comments, questions out there, folks?
Could I ask a question, please? Sorry.
Sure, Sean, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Wayne. That was a very good presentation. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Can I please ask you, would you consider bringing out an article that helps us students that's been struggling with quantum computing for many years, maybe which technology is best to follow if you would like to, say, for argument's sake, go do variation quantum eigensolvers? A lot of people say superconducting qubits is maybe the best way to go forward because that is a near term the NISQ or hybrid systems. And when I went into the Q shop, I didn't know that being good in F sharp would help me, or Jupyter, because that's what the guys at Microsoft make use of. And so I had to learn Jupyter, and I had to learn obviously F sharp because I come from C sharp background. Also, it was interesting to know that the topological qubit from Q sharp might be the late term in the next 10 years, a better system to follow. Is there any way that you would bring out an article that can help us to understand if we want to do quantum Fourier transforms, which system to follow, because it would really help us a lot. And thank you for the presentation. I appreciate it.
Sure. Could you send me an email with that? Because we're always looking for ways to help the community. And I think that would be something I wouldn't mind investigating and trying to produce. So if you can send me an email at matt@thequantumdaily.com, and then I'll pitch that at one of our editorial meetings and to see if we can get something going on that. I think it's a great idea, and I think that's what we really exist for, is to try to, those are things that I was not aware of, and if I can kind of try to sort that out for you and come out with a good piece to get more motivated students into it, I would definitely do it. I appreciate that.
Sorry, I
Thank you.
there. Is Microsoft's topological approach? Is that what he was talking about? Was it Microsoft's topological quantum approach? Is that what you're talking about?
So they're using non-abelian. They're trying to use the non-abelian anyons to a particle.
Not abelian aliens. I didn't hear that before. Anyons. Thanks.
Yeah, but it's not available at the moment. But if you follow that in Q sharp, maybe in the next 10 years, the real quantum supremacy might come from a natural state system. So when I started out, I started with superconducting, but I never realized that it might only be moderate term. You understand what I'm saying? As a student, it's difficult for us to understand which system to follow. You invest a lot in for free and hoping that at a future stage it will pay out. So I went for Q sharp because of the topological system. Future, next 10 years, I suppose.
Yeah, and I do think that we are trying to work on ways to, I'm trying to think of the word, benchmark, and we're trying to get a web kind of app that would help people kind of understand that a little more, where it's at. And I think, Sean, that question is probably questions that not just you, but I think everyone in the community is wondering, what is going to be the method, the system that takes us to the next step. So please send me an email and just to remind me about that, and I'll try to look into it and see what we're doing.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Matt, thank you. Thank you for a terrific presentation and a good way to frame how we talk about these very complex ideas and concepts and systems. And Terrell, thanks for bringing us together twice in one day.
Oh yeah, today was a double header. Yeah.
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 Thank you for organizing this.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks.
Appreciate it.
So,
And it also shows that it's not always quantity, you know? A lot of these Zoom meetings have 200-300 people, then you can't have open mics, right? And so it's nice to have like, you know, a handful. We can get some quality conversations going.
Yeah, this is nice.
yeah. And you know, I'm looking for more, you know, the whole theme of communications in quantum, I think is a way we can add value to the community, because it is an important aspect. We get lost in the physics and the science, and it's in this field in particular is really important. But let me ask one question and we'll end here, unless somebody has something profound to ask. You know, the Quantum Daily, I have a really hard time finding out anything about, like, the web page is there, which is great, but I think they're maybe based in Toronto, but I know nothing about the organization, like who's behind it, what's behind it.
Yeah, so we're actually based all over the world. There's the two co-founders, Alex is in the UK, then Evan Cubes is in Toronto.
Okay.
We have James, the other contributor, is in the UK as well. We have some folks in Russia. We're pretty well spread out, and we have tech side, and we have you know, all these different facets. So we're kind of spread out across the world.
Well, what's the business? I mean, is it a subscription based? I mean, the
No.
content's there for free. So, I mean, how's this working?
Yeah. So initially what we're doing is we're looking for advertising. We're also offering some consultancy. And the other thing that we are doing is we're building that database, and there will be a regular database, and then there will be a subscription-based database.
Okay.
So then we're going to try to get, we really feel right now we probably have one of the most complete databases, and it just seems to be getting better. So that's kind of the plan on growing it out. Other than that, it's just a lot of love and volunteerism on our part, but that's how we expect to build it out.
I noticed you have a learning section there, but it's empty. QC 101?
Oh, is it empty? Yeah, we're still, some of it is a work in progress.
No, I only bring that up to say that's a great limitation that someone can add to, so to speak. That's
Yeah,
Oh, sure.
yeah,
what I meant.
yeah. That's a great idea.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Matt. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope it's given you some fuel for thinking, you know, and then at least raise awareness of how we communicate in this field, and the way others are communicating to us too, perhaps. But hopefully this is just the beginning of a thought process for each of us. This is something that, you know, we're not gonna get in one day, obviously, but it's important to start to think about it. And so if anybody has any other ideas about, you know, I guess you could call this, it is a technology, but it's a non-technical aspect of our technology that we're all enamored with, if you will.
Yeah.
You know, come up with some, just let me know, and we'll get those folks talking about those subjects, and you know, we'll get Matt come back, you know.
Yeah, always willing.
Anytime.
One
Good.
marketing way to summarize it is it's sort of like bringing in people from the edge into the center. The ones in the center, the STEM people already know. They don't need us.
Yeah,
Right.
you're on the edge, Matt.
Yeah, I've always been there.
Anyway, you were going to say something though? But edge man. Anyway. Okay, guys, gals, have a good day. Matt, again, thanks, and we'll see you all next time. And I think I put the URL for the Quantum Daily in the chat. So if not, it's just an easy search. Have a good afternoon, everybody. And
See
watch
you.
out for the next article coming out. What are you working on right now, Matt?
I just put one on, I talked to the founders from the Unitary Fund, which I think so that's out today. I talked to Ilyas Khan from Cambridge Quantum Computing, fascinating guy. I'll have his story coming out soon too.
Cool. Yeah, there was a meetup last night, or was it? I think it was Tuesday. Usually Tuesday night. Unfortunately, they don't tape them. New York meetup had some of the folks from the quantum the fund. I want to say quantum
Unitary Fund.
Unitary Fund. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
My bad. Anyway, have a good afternoon, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.
Appreciate it again, Matt. We'll see you
No
around.
problem. Anytime.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.